And then there's so many things in there where it's like, how can I label the stress I'm feeling? Is it good stress or bad stress? Which good stress is the eustress, bad stress is distress. And so how can I even categorize those? Because the good stress, we actually need that in order to continue to engage in our life.
Hello, fellow humans, and welcome to the Fresh Perspectives podcast, where our intention is growing together and leading with love. I'm Peter Callahan, and I believe we each have incredible capacity to continue to learn and evolve as individuals and as a species, and bring way more love and a lot less fear into the world and our daily lives. Changing can be hard, and I've found that even if nothing changes, having the courage to see our challenges from a fresh perspective can change everything. I'm glad you're here. Today, as you just heard a little bit, we are connecting with my friend and colleague, Stephanie Simpson. Stephanie is an artist, coach, consultant, facilitator, speaker, and author of the 21-day stress management workbook. And Stephanie draws on her background in the arts, mindfulness, trauma, and psychology as she partners with people and different businesses and organizations to achieve their greatest potential by nurturing the connection between the mind, body, and spirit. As a certified yoga instructor and ICF, that's the International Coach Federation, certified professional coach, or a PCC, similar to me, Stephanie also holds a degree from Emerson College, a master's degree in dance performance and choreography from Smith College, and a master's in clinical psychology from Columbia. Her research focuses on fear, stress management, embodied leadership, as well as engagement and purpose, creativity and innovation, so many different areas. She's also on faculty at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, CUNY, and is one of the co-founders and artistic directors of the Reject Dance Theater, which we didn't get to talk to today, but I'm curious to hear more about the Reject Dance Theater. It sounds fun. In the conversation we did, however, as you just heard, talk a lot about stress and Stephanie's own journey with stress, studying and learning, especially that it's not all bad, as you just heard. There are these two types that we'll talk about. The difference between eustress and distress. We both share some personal challenges with self-care and social situations, how we might define success individually, how to reframe and avoid burnout, which is a big topic these days, as well as the value of experimentation and how challenging it can be to create a plan and, as I like to say, turn our knowledge into wisdom. And so I'm really excited to share with you this conversation with Stephanie today. Thanks so much for being here. All right, well, welcome, Stephanie. So glad to have you today.
I'm very excited to be here and have this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. So glad to have you. I know one of your sort of favorite topics is our relationship with ourselves and with our stress, really specifically. So maybe I'll just let you get started on this topic of stress and how we, maybe don't always view it in a way that's most useful or even accurate, especially kind of culturally, societally. So yeah, do you mind just starting there?
Yeah. So I think the best thing to start with is why I even got curious about stress. And so I would say it was, sometimes I forget what year we're in. Time feels very different since COVID. I would say probably back in like 2016, 2017, I was teaching full time at a private school here in New York City where I'm based. And something that I just kept like hearing all the time from students, from colleagues, from administrators was just this word stress all the time, right? Like everyone's like, oh, I'm so stressed out. I'm so stressed out. I'm so stressed out. And then I would always hear the next thing is like, I just got to make it through this and then I'll feel better. Right. And I don't know whether it's just partially who I am and how the environment I was raised in and stuff. And I was like, okay, great. Then things will be better once you get to that place. But then I would notice that that person would get to that place and then there was something else. Right. And the private school I was in, very fast paced, very achievement oriented, all of that. So there's just always something. And I felt in my body just very on alert all the time. And I didn't really have the language for that until later. So I just kept getting curious around the fact, why do we all keep saying we're stressed out and why aren't we doing anything about it? I got to a point in my life many years ago where I was like, I understand like venting and I understand complaining, but at some point you've got to do something to fix it, right? Like there's only so much you can complain and vent about. Like you got to take some action. And so I got really curious about this. And around that time, I was thinking about going back to grad school. I had previously gotten an MFA in dance performance and choreography, where I was really interested in my thesis in the mind body connection as it related to peak performance, like specifically at the time for dancers. And I was connected with the sports world a lot at the time, basketball specifically, and was talking to a lot of high level basketball coaches and hearing what they do for their athletes, both on an individual level and a group level. So studying that many years ago, I created these like mental training programs for performing artists that then I was starting to do with people outside the performing arts world. And that relationship I was looking at was really like fear, how fear and the stories and the thoughts we were telling ourselves, how that was changing the way that we were feeling internally, but also the actions and behaviors that we had and how could we get our mind and our body to work together. Then when this whole curiosity around stress, and I guess it's this really bad thing, how do we get rid of it, started coming up. And like I said, I was thinking about going back to grad school or doing something and ended up going back to grad school here in New York at Columbia for a psychology degree. It was a master's of clinical psychology with an emphasis in spirituality, mind, body. And while I was there, ended up doing a lot of work also in the organizational psychology department and really coming in with this lens of stress. And what I learned through the 2 years of research I did and the work I was doing was that a lot of what we call stress isn't actually stress. We just use that word a lot of time. And that the idea is not to, in a healthy relationship with stress, it is not to get rid of it, that we actually need a certain amount of it. And so much of what I was learning in that research for my thesis was so similar to the one that I was doing back in my MFA, which makes a lot of sense because the thing that sets off our stress cycle is fear. So it was just kind of like progressed itself. And so a lot of times when people say they're stressed out, they're actually afraid of something. And that fear can look in different ways, right? So fear, we also need, I went into that first master's being like, oh, we just have to get rid of fear. Like once fear is away, we can perform to our highest potential.
Right.
But that's not true either. We need a certain level of fear in order to stay at what I would call our sweet spot, which is our peak place. But if we're, all goes back to stories again, is like, if what we're afraid of becomes overwhelming, then yes, we're not going to do well. So being able to understand what we're afraid of, and then anxiety can also be something that we're feeling, but we're labeling as stress. And anxiety are just these irrational fears. And then what happens is either the fear or the anxiety, what typically happens is we start ruminating on that thought. So we begin to worry. And worry is just repeating those same thoughts over and over again. And so the visual I always use is we go down the downward spiral, right? We just start like moving down the downward spiral, which then causes stress, which is the idea that we don't have the resources and the capability to do the thing that we're being asked to do. And so that can play out in many different ways. And I can give an example if we're interested in that. But then stress, prolonged stress, can lead to burnout, but it doesn't have to. And so that's when I started realizing, oh, where are these moments that we can create roadblocks internally and externally, where we don't then get to either that very much stressful, overwhelmed place or burnout, right? And then there's so many things in there where it's like, how can I label the stress I'm feeling? Is it good stress or bad stress? Which good stress is the eustress, bad stress is distress. And so it's like, how can I even categorize those? Because the good stress, we actually need that in order to continue to engage in our lives, like literally just engage in our lives, and then also get to that place of peak performance.
Thank you. Yes. So much in there, Stephanie. I really appreciate it. I had this response of like, yes, I do spiral downward when I'm worried about something. Like I was very much resonating with the way you're saying that. And And I love this term eustress. I think this is such a valuable, it has been for me anyway, to recognize like, there are benefits to this experience as
Mm.
well. It is not all bad. And probably why I love the term fresh perspectives. How do we look at this or understand ourselves, the world, these concepts a little bit differently so that we can relate to them maybe a little bit differently and use them to our advantage. So yeah, maybe before I go to another question, I mean, there's so many things to follow back up on, but maybe an
Mhm.
example would be helpful. You had said there, there are some examples of this that might be relatable for folks.
Yeah. So I'll give a personal example. There's so many. So I'm trying to figure out which one do I want to go with. I think the thing too, to like completely name that even though stress management and our relationship with stress is like a big part of my business of both teaching classes at college level and coaching people on it, I too am practicing this every day, all day. And I'm definitely not like an expert in it in my own life, which is funny. I always say we teach the thing we need to know, we need to learn the most. And I was like, yep, this makes sense.
If we're
Uh,
lucky.
so
Absolutely.
exactly, exactly. So I guess the example I will say, well, let's just put it this way. I just came back from being away for a week and it wasn't like a full vacation. I took some days that I wasn't taking any calls or I definitely did kind of like shut down, but there was some working involved in as well. So that transition for me always from like just the being away and coming back can be overwhelming to me. So
Mm.
even that right there, I worked really hard over time to not use the word stress because even the thing I'm naming has a lot of power. So I've now realized, okay, I'm feeling overwhelmed. I'm not feeling stressed necessarily, but years ago, I might have been like, oh, I'm stressed out. Right. So I'm feeling overwhelmed when I get back because of the transition. And what happens in my head is I start going, oh my God, I have to do this. Oh my God, I have to do this. I'm going to be so tired. I start creating stories before it even happens. Like I've already decided I'm going to be tired when I get off the plane. Well, I don't know. I haven't done it yet. Right. But I've already decided that in my head. And then I'm like, and then I got to do this. And then I got to do this. And then I got to do this. And so all of a sudden the list just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so if I can notice that, which I will say first, is our body notices it, but many of us are not fully connected and in tune with our body, myself included many times, is that like my body feels it first. And if I can just take a moment to pause, listen to my body, and then get curious and be like, okay, what is it? Because my brain is going to take over, right? It already did creating that list, right? Like that's my go-to. It's like, then there's this, and there's this, and there's this, and there's this. And it's like, yeah, okay, that is overwhelming. That is threat right there, which the stress cycle is, it starts with a perceived threat. So it's what you just said, new perspectives. So I always say to people, our perceived threat is the stressor. Perceived is the key word there. We get to change a different perspective, a different thought, or a different lens. And if we can shift that lens and that perspective, we shift the thing that we're afraid of, right? So for me, the thing that I'm afraid of is like, oh, if I don't do everything right away, then the narrative in my head is like, then I'm not being successful. I'm not performing the way I should be. I'm not being successful. What my brain starts doing is like trying to like deal with it, but all it's doing is worry and creating more worry and stuff. Whereas if I stopped and took a breath, which one of my brain creates more worry, guess what happens? I get tired and then I completely shut down, which is understandable because the stressor then activates the stress cycle, which is fight, flight, freeze. And now the fourth one is fawn. So I will either like run away from something and avoid it, or I'll freeze, which could look like taking a nap or something like that. In this one, I don't usually fight back for it. My go-to is like run away or freeze. And then the outcome, that what we call the strain, is usually not the thing I want, right? It's usually I'm now even more behind or more exhausted or any of that sort of stuff. So if I can stop and pause and go, okay, what's happening right now? Maybe practice some of my mindfulness techniques, breath techniques. And then what that's actually doing in your brain is it's helping it get out of the stress cycle, come back to the present moment and relax the nervous system, right? When we're in fight, flight, or freeze, we're in the sympathetic nervous system. So all the energy is going out. And so being able to, maybe it is being like, I need to go for a walk for 20 minutes, right? I'm going to give myself that time to go for a walk, even though that may sound like I'm avoiding. nope, I'm telling myself 20-minute walk so I can get back and then be like, what can I do from here? Or I sit in silence for 10 minutes, or I breathe intentionally for 5 minutes and then be like, what can I do from here? And then it's about knowing yourself. So for me, I know that like, what's the easiest thing I can do so that I feel like, yes, I did something. For others, it may be like, okay, I'm going to tackle that big thing first because then it's out of the way. And that's where the self-awareness comes in. So you can't really change your relationship with stress if you don't stop and pause and become more aware of yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you. If that's not one theme that I will relentlessly keep coming back to in these conversations, it's just stopping and pausing. Right. I'm even hearing
Mm,
some self-compassion in here for yourself. Like, "Ah, it's understandable. This is what's happening to me." And that's
mhm,
always true for all of us, right? When our mind is doing
mhm.
these things to us, like you're saying, and creating this degree of overwhelm, that's understandable. And it's even okay that it's happening. We don't even have to make that wrong or bad to first just acknowledge, accept it. And I really appreciate the way you're speaking to it. It can seem counterintuitive to not only to stop and pause, but then to do something different other than start chipping away immediately at that list.
Yes. And I was thinking as you were saying, and then I was smiling because I was visualizing what happens. I mean, so we're animals, right? This all comes from being an animal and having to survive, in threatening situation. However, as we've evolved, what was threatening many, many, many years ago to us is not the same threat now. But our body doesn't know the difference. The hormones still release, and we go into this tunnel vision. And it's like, well, this is what I have to do. And our body, it's not instinctual to go, wait a second, let's take a little pause first. Let's get some clarity. And then let's be more intentional and mindful and conscious about what we're doing, as opposed to just going into unconscious behavior, which if we stop and go, oh, wait a second, the last time I just kind of pushed through this didn't work out so well. So why am I doing that again? Well, because we're habitual beings. And until we stop and get aware and consciously choose a different thing every single time to create a new pathway in the brain, which is what neuroplasticity is, nothing will ever change. But when we can stop and go, wait, let's take a pause. Let's take what would be the best thing to try right now. We also can remind ourselves, oh, wait, I made it through last time. I survived last time. I didn't get fired from any job. Friends didn't hate me, things like that. I was fine. Oh, so I am safe. Oh, okay. What can I do now that I feel safe? So that's where like the self compassion and really it all comes down to safety. So one of the first things I say to myself or I'll offer to clients at times is like, when you notice you're feeling it in your body, we talk about what are some of those signs, right? Or you notice that your brain is doing that downward spiral. How can you pause? How can you take a deep breath? And how can you remind yourself that you're safe? Most of the times we are.
Most of the time, we're lucky. Exactly. Yes, I am safe. And it's bringing up really strongly in me, Stephanie, how challenging this is to do for any of us, no matter what. But, there's all this work out there about habit formation and healthy habits and creating practices. And, for myself, I'm just getting back from a 7-day silent retreat up at Insight Meditation Society in Massachusetts. And part of my goal, my reason for doing that is not only the research behind retreats and the value of slowing down over long periods, but is to be able to have more resources when I come back. I'm about to have a second child,
Mm-hmm.
and there's certainly a part of my mind that's like, all right, I'm going to do this, and there's going to be massive ROI. The return on investment of this time spent is going to be huge. And I really do believe that. And I notice in myself having a consistent practice in general, practicing when things are calm and I do feel safe builds up this muscle for when things are not.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I got back
Mm-hmm.
on Sunday from this retreat and we had just, my brother and sister-in-law and their daughter over for like Easter dinner. And I wasn't worried about it. So, no problem. It's just people close to me. It's not going to be, I'll be totally fine. And yet I still got overwhelmed. I still had this, and I spent the week trying to reconnect with my body, which I historically have been terrible at. And I was really able to feel it. I could feel my heart rate increasing and I could just notice these thoughts in my mind, but I also didn't stop and pause. Like I had dishes to do and I was doing an Easter egg hunt with my daughter, and like lots of it was joyful, and it
Mhm.
objectively was not remotely stressful or overwhelming. And yet I was having that experience. The cool thing was I could be with it. The unfortunate part was I still didn't want to pause and slow down and stop. I just wanted to keep engaging and
Mm.
be there and not be the weirdo who needed to go take a few minutes every half an hour to like bring
Mm.
myself back down. So that is just really interesting, the the cultural expectations, the stories I'm telling myself, and just this desire, like you're saying, to be successful, whether that's personally or professionally, and trying to be honest, in this case with myself, about what does give me the best chance for success? How
Mm.
often, how much time, and that can just for me can be really challenging. How is that for you?
Oh yeah, so many things that you said there. First, just I appreciate you sharing an example of how it plays out in your life very recently. What still sticks out to me is when you're like, I don't want to be the weirdo that has to leave and, be by myself for a little bit. And that really resonated with me because I find, and I'm trying to be better about this, is not apologizing for the things I need, right? So that's not quite what the fawn response is. Fawn response is like a people pleasing thing. Like, okay, I'll do all this for everybody because once everybody else is okay, then I feel safe.
Right.
And so it's not quite what you were saying, but like this idea of, I always ask myself, yeah, when I'm around a couple of years ago in one of the relationships that I was in, I very much appreciated being around like his family and his friends and all of that, but it got a lot for me at times. But it was really hard for me to be like, I'm going to just go for a walk on my own right now. And I had to do a lot of work around why was it so hard for me to just date that for somebody else. And for me, what came up was, well, what if I'm missing out on something? I have a lot of like fear of missing out sometimes.
FOMO is real.
And a part of, yeah. And part of it was like, what if when I leave, they start saying things about me?
Yeah.
And I started really like realizing that I have that part of it's not even most of it's and sometimes not the fear of missing out. It's that I have the control, not really, but control. When I'm there, I can monitor everything that's going on and I can know what they think about me, which you never really know what anybody thinks about you. And so instead of just trusting, you need a break, go do your thing. And who cares if they're talking about you? Also, they're probably not. You're not that right? Like we are important, but we're not important, So like this thing in my head that I'm like, well, of course they're gonna be talking about. No, they're probably not. And so like what was that about, in my life that I was creating more overwhelm and stress because I wasn't just taking care of myself. And how weird that is, which is funny. I was listening to a podcast this morning and the interviewee was like in the middle of the interview was like, there's something blowing on me. Can we turn that off? They were all in person. And the host was like, yeah, sure, totally. And then I just want to celebrate the fact that you're like non-codependency. And the person was like, what do you mean? He's like, well, I would have just sat through the entire interview freezing because I wouldn't have wanted to say anything because of whatever reason. And the guy was like, why wouldn't I want to say anything? If I'm cold, I'm cold. I'm going to tell the person that and he's like, yeah, but my codependency would have come up and I'd been like, oh, maybe they don't like me. He's like, you don't like me over the fact that I say I'm cold. And they had this whole interesting conversation. I was like, oh, that's me though. I probably would have sat there just cold because I didn't want to like bother anybody or have them go, oh, why is she cold? Right. Like all of that. So I don't even know if that makes sense. But,
Completely, completely. And there's different
but this,
situations
like,
that apply to each of us, right? We're all have that in different ways in different moments. I think that's totally normal.
yeah. This idea, the other thing that struck me was this idea of success. So I'm always thinking, and with my clients and with my students, it comes up all the time. It's like, well, how are you defining success? Right. So we think of success and stress. They're so linked in so many ways, both in a facilitating way and a debilitating way, because sometimes what creates the stress or the overwhelm or the worry or the fear, whichever place we want to put it, is that we're not living up to some definition of success. So if we really stop and like think about it, it's not our definition. It's someone else's that we're trying to like live up to, which is why it's creating this overwhelm in such a debilitating way. Whereas stress can also be helpful in success because if we think about like a bell curve, We want to be right here with our stress. And so if we're down here, we're probably bored. We don't have a lot of stress. There's not a lot that's like, giving us that pressure. Well, then we're probably going to get disengaged, maybe feel a little depressed at times because there's nothing exciting to us. We're not feeling challenged, whether it's personally or professionally, all of that. And so we tend to disengage and our performance tends to be lower because of that, right? On the other end of it, we have so much pressure and so much overwhelm that we also have low performance because we become debilitated because we're like, oh my God, there's so much. And like our body is just like this. And we're like, we don't know where to go. We don't know where to be paralyzed, right? We have to be somewhere in the middle here, which also relates with the flow theory, which is like that task challenge balance where we're being challenged in different ways, but in a way that like helps us to continue to move forward. Not that we're being so challenged and we don't have the capacity to get there where it becomes that overwhelm. And so it's how are we finding that place? And the example I always give is I'm a runner and I didn't start running until like 2016. I'd never really run before. I played sports when I was younger, but long time ago. And I decided I wanted to do the New York City Marathon. Sounds a little crazy and wild, and it was. But I was able to do it in a year with a lot of hard work. I always want to tell people like a lot of hard work, a lot of training. I got a lot of help. I, reached out to the people I needed to reach out to. But when I would see training programs, there's a reason why they're designed the way they are. It's to be able to put a certain amount of stress on your body, on your mind, on your emotion in a way that's going to help you grow. But if you put too much too soon, what happens? You get injured. Also, as you're continuously doing this, if you don't take rest days, if you don't get massages, if you don't roll out, if you're not stretching, you get injured. And I did that first year because I wasn't taking care of myself on those rest days. And I always remind myself that it literally is physical metaphor for every other thing, whether it's building a business or building a family, right? Building a relationship. There has to be moments of rest and like pure rest. And if you're doing too much, too fast, too soon, there's going to be a rupture somewhere.
Absolutely, Stephanie. Absolutely. And this is where this term burnout, I think, has become so prevalent. And I want to come back to that in a second, but what you're speaking to is also a lot of our culture uses the term balance. I think you and I tend toward the word harmony, right? So work-life balance, whatever you're talking about, all levels of balance. Balance denotes this perfect, equal on both sides, which might happen in fleeting moments a couple times a year, probably not even on a daily basis. Whereas harmony, we're ebbing and flowing and we're checking in and noticing what's happening, and to be able to be honest with ourselves. A lot of it comes back to like, all right, this question, what do I need? What's happening right now? What's going on? And what do I need? How do I care for myself? And obviously having the tools and more understanding and practices goes a long way. But to be able to actually answer that question and give it to yourself often goes against our cultural messaging and this conditioning that we have. So I really appreciate you speaking to your experience. And while you have many practices and are able to notice, it doesn't mean you're exempt from having these challenges. And I love the sentence you said earlier when we started: prolonged stress can lead to burnout. I'm hearing a lot of people reference, I'm really feeling burned out. Like I think I'm burned out. And I just don't find it's kind of a buzzword, and I don't find it very useful. I love to try and help people acknowledge this spectrum of the amount of challenge that we're experiencing, whatever terms we want to use, and kind of celebrating, all right, it sounds like you're really noticing that the current approach is not sustainable for you. This prolonged stress, prolonged anxiety, overwhelm, trying to do more than is actually best for you. Completely understandably based on these cultural messages that we're getting. And so you might be heading toward burnout, but most likely you'll know when you're burnt out, like that there's nothing left potentially, depending on how we're defining burnout, I suppose. But to be able to check in along the way and even use those moments of injury where something happens as maybe wake up call feels dramatic, but as an indicator, like, oh, that's a mess. Just like pain in our body, is our body just letting us know? I think of it as a child, like, hey, I need some attention. something here isn't going well. And so much of mindfulness practice that I love is coming back to that, turning toward it and asking, like, how are things going? Like, what is it that you need? Coming back to this question. So yeah, thank you for sharing all those examples.
I would love to just share as I was listening to you, because I was like, wow, we call it mindfulness, which at first I was like, oh, that's in the mind. And then as you're talking, I was like, well, in the somatic world, we believe that the body is the mind, right? Mind as body, right? And so the mindfulness is really how are we coming back to our body, which and science is getting to this point where it's like, yeah, the brain is not just up here. The brain is the body. The nervous system is what's activated this whole time. And this idea of what is my body telling me, as opposed to what is this like other narrator in my head,
This
this
wonderful
voiceover
computer
artist.
that does so much for us, and yet we allow it to
Yeah.
drive rather than letting the body, the heart be the captain, the conductor, and allowing the computer to back us up and help calculate the data.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's so many things that came up as you were speaking about. I agree that the word burnout is become a buzzword. It was even pre-COVID, and companies like Deloitte and
Right.
all of them were doing research on it and all of that. And while many of it is true, it has become one of these like, oh, this is the word, like that we're going to use and hold on to. And I appreciate that you work with your clients on being like, okay, well, let's look at the spectrum, right? Because it definitely is. It's definitely a spectrum. My instinct always says that you'll know because your body, as we were saying, will tell you you'll get sick. And the science is there to back it up because what's happening is when you're going into that stress cycle, like I mentioned before, you're going into fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, and your catabolic hormones are being released. So your cortisol and your adrenaline and all of that. And though that is really helpful for shorter periods of time and totally necessary at places. So this is again that idea of stress is not bad or good. It's whether it's propelling us forward or it's holding us back. There are moments where we really want our fight, flight, or freeze to be in effect. If we are in danger, I hope you run away or fight back or all of that. There's always that big example of like the mother getting like Herculean strength because they need to get their kid out of a situation, right? That is exactly when stress is very important and we want it to kick in. But if that person is in that Herculean state all the time over a period of time, you just can't do that. So that's where the sustainability thing comes in. So when I coach people and teach people about their relationship with stress, we look at it in 4 different components. So we really want to look at it comprehensively. We need to check into these 4 different boxes. So one of them is source management. And in order to even know that, you need to know where your stressors are coming from. What is the source of them? And it's really amazing that, going back to that first story of why I got interested in it, was that I would start asking people out of curiosity, well, what is it that's stressing you out? And even that one question, many people didn't know how to answer that because we're just so programmed to say that we're stressed. And because a lot of our society is about competition, is someone will be like, oh yeah, well, look what I have to do, which also then we're not holding space for each other. We're not caring for each other when we're just kind of adding and piling. So if we can just get clear, what are the stressors? So going back to my example of transitioning back to home. Okay, well, there's no food in my house. So that's one. I got to figure out how to get food, right? I may be tired. I have this to do. I have that to do. If I can almost list those out and go, here's the source. This is what it's coming from. Then I can create a plan to either reduce the source or eliminate it. Not in every case can we eliminate it, but how can we reduce it? So that's one thing. The next one is prevention. So if I know that I am always a little overwhelmed when I'm coming back from traveling, well, I can prevent that overwhelm or a lot of the overwhelm if maybe that first day back, I don't start taking calls until the afternoon. Because then I have the whole morning to kind of do the like human things I need to do to then feel like I'm prepared to be there for my clients or to take meetings. So that's a prevention thing. I'm not jumping out of bed at 9 a.m. I have my first coaching call the next day. I mean, that's what I used to do. And it was terrible for both me and the client. So it's like, okay, that's a prevention thing. For teams that I work with, of course, there are going to be times that are stressful. if you have, like, depending on what type of team it is, and you have a project coming around, and then you know another project's going to come, but you also know that there's this and there's this. And as a manager, you realize that so and so's on PTO here and there. Yeah, zooming out and going, how can we prevent unnecessary stress by maybe we need to bring in a contractor for, part of this, or maybe we need to, shift the workload in some ways, so that we can prevent some of these things coming forward. There's some things we're not going to be able to prevent, right? Then the third category is thought management. So yeah, there are certain things we can't prevent. There are certain sources we can't really reduce or eliminate. So how can I change the way I'm thinking about them? Because again, if I change the way I'm thinking about them and I ask myself, what am I learning from this? Or how is this helping me? Then I shift the fact that I don't think of it as threatening as much. I think of it as something manageable, or maybe, even a positive experience at the end of the day. And then the last category being relaxation. So mindfulness, breath practices, walking, like tapping into your creativity, movement, any of that sort of stuff. Some of those can be done right in the moment. We always have access to our breath. Some of it can be like built in. I'm going to go to yoga or whatever it may be. So that you're really creating this holistic plan for yourself. Whereas a lot of times people look at it as like, I'm going to manage my stress when I go to the gym, and that's what I do. Or I'll ask companies, what are you doing for your employees? And I'm like, well, we have yoga on Fridays, at lunch. And I'm like, well, that's really kind that you do that. I really hope people are eating at lunch, because that's a basic human need. Secondly, like, yoga is great, but how are you creating systems or empowering them with tools that they can use in the moment? Like when they get into a meeting that starts getting tense, does everyone have the ability to get up and do a downward dog if they need to in the middle of the meeting? Which, by the way, I think is a great idea. And I hope people start implementing that, but probably not. So what are the other things that we're doing that create systems and containers and give people the tools to be able to do this both in a zoomed in way and a zoomed out way?
Zoomed in and zoomed out. Yes, the different lenses. Awesome. So can I try and restate just to see if I got the 4 steps? Because I think this could be super
Sure.
useful for folks. So the first step was, and I'm forgetting the exact words used, but awareness of what's happening. Is that right? How would you phrase it?
Yes. Source management.
Source management. Where is this stress coming from? What's happening? Step 2, which I want to unpack a little bit more, creating a plan. Right, Art? How might I be able to work with this? Step 3 is thought management. So noticing where our mind is going and what's happening in our minds. And then step 4 is around practices. And basically, what can I do? What are the resources that I have to support myself around these different stressors?
Yes. And I will just say that the way I define all the information you got was correct. The categories I would say was source management, prevention, thought management, relaxation.
Got it.
And then there are tools within all of them.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. I focused in on this plan piece. It's just something that's come up a lot from me with others, as I can notice this in myself and I hear from others. Well, plans always go wrong anyway. So why plan at all? So why? And it's even to what you're speaking of from coming back, like, can I just write down the source management? Can I just write these down? It doesn't even have to be, here's what I'll do with it, but let me just have it all listed out. And I love just getting it out of our brain and on paper or on whatever app we use, or just our scratch pad or notepad, but just having it written down. And I love the military quote, no plans survives first contact in battle. That doesn't mean that they don't take the time to plan, right? There is immense value in being able to just have something down, look at it. From my perspective, one of the most valuable things is then, as we go about executing some strategy to try and get those things done, we have some reference to, how did that go? Oh, right. This is what I was thinking would happen. Now I can reflect back. And the other quote that I love is, we don't learn from experience. We learn from reflecting on our experience. Again, coming back to pausing, if you don't take this time to slow down, check in, reflect, how did that go? What was I hoping to accomplish? What actually happened? That can really deepen a sense of learning and self-understanding, because there's all these books, there's many resources on how best to do these things. Maybe those work for us. Maybe they don't. And it can take a lot of prefrontal cortex energy to experiment and to try something new. And so how do we just lower that barrier for ourselves and give ourselves some reference, some resource to be able to check back in? How much does that match up with sort of the research and the work you've done?
Mhm. So much. So the word that kept coming up for me is transformation. So in the corporate world, big words, change management. Well, change management is transformation. And what you were saying about we don't learn from experience, we actually learn from our reflection on the experience. So transformative learning theory would say, yes, you have to have an experience of some sort first. And really any experience has the potential to be transformative. Yet rarely are they, because we don't then take the time to pause afterwards, probably many times afterwards, to reflect on the experience. And then the actual transformation change part is how are we integrating that reflection, that insight going forward? And why a lot of change management doesn't work, myself included. I'll go off and do a retreat somewhere or whatever it may be, or traveling. Traveling can be incredibly transformational. But if I don't then take the time to stop afterwards and go, what did I learn from that? How do I want to integrate it going forward? Then it was just a fun experience, right? And when I'm talking to like corporate clients, I'm like, yeah, that's great that you're sending people off to these different experiences and these different conferences. I'm sure they'll have a great time. What's your plan? What's your integration plan on how to integrate what they learned going forward? Because that's where the actual ROI doesn't happen, because mostly, and this is not a judgment on anybody, this is what happens as human beings. It's like, we go to this conference, we learn this thing. We're like, oh my God, this is great. It's amazing. I can't wait to do this with my team. You come back, you try to do it with your team. Maybe it's not successful. Here's that word success again. The first time you do it, you get frustrated. So then you don't do it again. Or you try it and you're like, I don't know that I did this right. Well, of course, you're trying something new. We're not always going to be great at something the first time we try it. Also, no one else in your team went to that same conference or workshop. So we also have to have some grace and patience in allowing them to understand the change. So in order to really create that transformation, there has to be time for reflection, time for insight, and then time for integration. And then that's where one of the reasons I became a coach was having someone like a coach be there to partner with you as you go through integrating this and working through the obstacles, the frustrations, the needing to be more patient, the trying new things, and knowing that you're not alone, so that over a period of time, you see these small things shifting. And then that's when it creates a greater ROI, because those small things shifting over a period of time tend to last longer, because you're doing it, you're building new habits is really what you're doing. And you're shifting the culture or changing the culture, whatever that might be. But it takes time.
It takes time. Yes. To make it sustainable. And sometimes we want the big wins, the big successes. How can I hack this and flip the switch overnight? And that's not always how it works. Thank you, Stephanie. So I'm looking at the time. I'm realizing, as we knew, we're not going to get to all the topics that we thought about.
Yeah.
And, you talked about your North Star in some of the
Mhm.
notes that we had before today. So I wonder if we could maybe integrate that, because I think the other topic that relates to this stress and these practices that we're talking about. And like you said, I feel it's an honor to get to create this space with people every day to do this reflection and check in. I know that's kind of part of what this North Star is for you. And I do my best at the end.
Mhm.
So we're using coaching to reflect and learn and bring that learning home. And then I do my best. I'm sorry to those, I don't do this every time, but to ask at the end of every coaching session, all right, what did you learn from this reflecting? So it's like, how do we just keep cascading this question and to keep checking in at whatever cadence is useful to integrate it. But anyway, I'm really curious to ask about sort of maybe that North Star, where that comes from, and probably how that led into you taking this leap in the last couple of years of going from having a full-time job to being an entrepreneur and a solopreneur right now.
Yeah. Great question. So I started working on my North Star statement many years ago. I want to say probably around 2016 was a really pivotal year for me in different ways. I was really trying to start figuring out what this consulting thing could look like. I was teaching full time at a school, but also was coaching for different places and doing workshops and was still performing as a dance and musical theater artist and directing, choreographing a lot. And so there's all these different things I was doing. And part of it came out of a way to just have something really concrete to share with people because the comments or the feedback I would get a lot from people were like, oh my God, you're doing so many different things. Like they're so different from each other. Whereas I didn't feel that way at all. Internally, I was like, they're not different from each other. They're all doing the same thing, just in a different vehicle. Like the intention behind all of them is the same, just the way in which it's being executed may look different to the outside world. So part of me was getting frustrated that I always felt like I had to almost like defend myself to people, but also was a way for me to get clear on what it was I was already feeling internally and be able to communicate that in a way that then made sense to other people. Because I think as we both probably realize when you're building a business, yeah, you may think you're great at something, but if you can't communicate that to someone else, no one's going to ever hire you. So having to be like, well, this is the great opportunity. It was frustrating. It was causing a lot of stress that I was having to defend myself all the time. And I was like, well, let's take this as an opportunity. So I started getting really clear on what is it that I feel like I'm doing? What is it that I am passionate about? What is it that is similar? If I reflected on all the different things I was doing, what was it that was coming out of all those experiences, and sat down and after many, many different iterations, came up with what my North Star statement is, which is I create and hold safe spaces for people to understand themselves more deeply so that they can connect with others and the world around them in more meaningful ways. And some people might look at that as like a mission or a brand. That's fine. I really like stars. And North Star just kind of resonated with me more. And because the North Star, typically that's your guiding light. If you know where North is, you can figure out which direction to go. For me, it also has helped me to use it as a compass as to what I say yes and no to in all aspects of my life. So really thinking, oh, that person just pitched me this opportunity. Sounds interesting. Does it really align and resonate with my North Star and what I'm trying to build in my life? And then it's like, you know what? It's not right now. And then I can really, with clarity and confidence, be like, thank you. This just isn't where I'm at right now. Versus other times being, yeah, this is really kind of aligning with where I'm at. And so that I'm also then creating, going back to that harmony word, harmony and alignment in my life so that I can continue to flow in the ways that I need to flow in to stay sustainable. And sometimes the things I've said yes to like a year and a half ago that felt like they were really in there, maybe now they're not, they've run their course. And being honest with myself of saying, all right, I'm ready to let that go. I've learned so much from this experience. I've now even honed in on what that statement means even more to me. And that's not in alignment anymore with that statement. So how can I let that go to make space for more things that are in better alignment?
Beautiful. Thank you. Can we hear the North Star one more time? I just loved it. I'd love to.
Yeah, sure. So I create and hold safe spaces so that people can understand themselves more deeply so that they can connect with others and the world around them in more meaningful ways. I also firmly believe, this is my own belief, that we can only connect with others to the extent to which we've connected with ourselves.
Wow. Thank you. Yeah, I completely agree. And it immediately terrifies me of like, how connected with myself am I really? Like I'm
I
practicing
said
this.
that. And then I was like, oh gosh. Like,
oh man. Yes. Yes, the
yeah.
paradox is real. I love that because for me, the term that I've been using for the last year or two now, I think I came up with, I love the term North Star, and I actually have it for the podcast here. I sort of said my hope, my vision, my true north for me is a world that leads with love.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I sort of say my purpose statement at the moment, that can always change, but is bringing my purpose, as far as I can tell, and this applies to parenting and partnership and leadership and professional realms, is bringing more love into leadership. So whatever format, and it's just terminology that works for me. And to me, it's completely aligned with what you're saying as well. And it's just finding this language that works for each of us. And exactly like you said, like creating the space sort of, I heard a quote that I'm not going to be able to reproduce, but this idea that in order to, and this really goes back to everything we've been talking about, in order to succeed, like really get along in today's externally focused world, we need to ignore our internal instincts on many levels. And
Mm,
what I'm hearing from you, and certainly what I'm trying to communicate, is an invitation to slow down and come back to our intuition, which don't even know if I can hear or understand a lot of the time, but I believe it does not come from our heads from up here. I believe it is so much more somatic, so much more from our body. And I
mhm,
feel very limited still or stunted, let alone as a white cis male in our supremacist culture. But just, I think for a vast majority of us, this is not training or learning or understanding that we've been given, despite the thousands of human generations of indigenous cultures and, wisdom that has spoke to just this, and
mhm,
it's we've determined this independently many thousands of times, and yet for many reasons, which we could do our best to guess at, but no need to unpack right now, like this, we're very far from right now. And so I'm just really
mhm.
grateful for all the work that you're doing and for your willingness to have this conversation, to keep coming back and talking about these things, and to bring the vulnerability that you are. And it can be challenging for me too, but you inspire me to open myself up and say, like, yeah, it's really, no one has any of this figured out. I love the term. The only difference between an expert and a novice is the expert knows we're all winging it. We're all to different levels and degrees, but I mean, especially now, like no one knows everything. No one has it all figured out,
Mhm,
despite many people coming across like they do, and sort of sharing maybe even similar messages to the ones we are, with this language that's absolutist or this
mm,
certainty. And I just love the phrase, I don't know, the concept of beginner's mind. I'm not sure. And to your point from earlier about experimentation and trying things, look, why don't I have an experience? Let me take some steps and then step back and see how that went, and be as intentional as we can. I found myself intimidated, like you said too, about like, all right, what's my plan for integration? Like, I don't know. I'm going to do my best to remember what I learned and
mhm.
bring it back up. And I noticed in myself, I could even be more intentional about. I love taking in as much information as possible and just kind of hoping like some of that will stick. You know? But even from today, from
Mm,
whoever's might be listening to this conversation, like what's one thing? What really
yes.
stuck with me? What's resonating with me? And how can I bring that back? I was telling you earlier from my retreat, one of the main things that I'm taking back from last week is this idea, instead of being out through my eyes and intense and focused, trying to come in, back, and like, stay inside
Mm,
myself, feel the back of my body, and do my best to feel that sense of weight or gravity to just keep me, the cheesy word of like grounded, right? Or centered. I could say those will sound like a good idea, but this is a little bit more practical for me of like, how do I feel that? And I've probably done it 5 or 10 times throughout our conversation, like, because I'm so interested in what you're
mm,
saying. And like, I have so many taking notes and what do I want to do? I tried to mute earlier while I drank. Pretty sure I failed that, but it's in, back, and down, right? All okay. There's maybe to your story about the family situation. No one's really paying that much attention. There might be moments of judgment, and those are fleeting, and we're all back to worrying about ourselves. So can we just
mm.
allow ourselves to settle and again be honest with ourselves, check back in?
So many wonderful things there. And I know we're at time, but some things that like really stuck out to me
Sure.
and words that came to mind as you were speaking, this idea of experimentation. And it kind of went back to something you said earlier of like, we need to have this plan or we need to have this or we need to have that. And one of the things that very early on when I was creating the work that I was doing around stress and stress management, I actually got really overwhelmed. Like when I did my yoga teacher training, it was like, well, you got to practice yoga every day. And I felt so constricted by that. Or the meditation mindfulness work, well, you got to practice every day. And I'm like, oh my God, I didn't practice today. I failed. And I started realizing that was actually creating more distress And it was, wait a second, what worked for me today may not work for me tomorrow. So what could I try? What could I experiment with? And what works for me may never work for you, and vice versa. And so how can we continue to be open to learning new things and new tools and play around with them? So that would be the other word, is how can we play more? Because there's so much research around the fact that we actually learn through play. And that if we're not willing to just kind of be like, let's see what happens. And that actual play is different than game. That play is just the pure fun, enjoyment, being in the flow, doing the thing without that added who is winning, who is this, who's that, because then it becomes something different. The judgment comes in, right? Whereas when you're very much in play, there is no judgment. And the other thing that came up as you were speaking is that all these little judgments we're placing, most of them are not real, right? Like they're the story that we made up of, even just the idea of, I tried this thing and it failed. And it's like, well, that's a judgment for me. And this will be my last thing, is like one of the biggest transitions from going from a full-time job where a schedule was given to me and there were specific things that needed to be done and blah, blah, blah. And I very much wanted to get out of that, to now a place where I get to make my own schedule. I get to create all of that, which sounds really wonderful and freeing, has been really challenging for me at times, because I'll spend a day and at the end of the day, I'll be like, well, this was a terrible day. I was not productive at all. And then I'll be like, well, how am I defining productivity? And I had to stop and catch myself in being like, am I defining it by how many billable hours I have this week? Or am I defining it as how much time I took to go out and play? Am I defining it as like, all these different things? And it's really, to me, as hard as it has been at times, the gift of being this solopreneur right now is really been to check into the systems, the conditions that I have that I didn't even know I had at times, and being like, is this working for me? And if it's not, how do I want to change it? And then having the self-compassion to know that it's not going to change right away. That just because I had the awareness one day about it doesn't mean that that's not going to come up next week and the week after and the week after. And how can I keep reminding myself of that so that it does become something that I can finally let go of?
Yes to everything. Reminding myself. I'm going to try and limit my Dan Harris references from the 10% Happier podcast. It's one of my favorites, and I don't want to copy his work, but this idea of the word for mindfulness, just because you referenced this earlier too, the original Pali word is sati for mindfulness. And one of the original translations, possibly more accurate, instead of mindfulness, as you spoke to, is remembering. Just remembering. And I love to say it as remembering what's important. Remembering, to whatever degree we're aware of, who we are and what we want. And that's the work I love to do with people. It's like, let's chip away at answering some of those questions. And it's also a practice for me. Every time I use the word work, I almost did it earlier. I said professional instead. But every time I use the word work, I try and switch it to play. How can I relate to my entire life as playing with? Just not to not take it seriously, but to not take it too seriously, and to relate to it in the most useful, effective, harmonious way possible, as opposed to, you said earlier, trying to control and squeeze every ounce of, effectiveness and productivity out of each moment, which I'm pretty confident will not actually get me what I ultimately want, which is some sense of meaning and inner peace. So thank you so much for all of these lessons today. Thank you for playing along with me. This has been so much fun. And yeah, we could just keep going right now. Maybe we'll just do episode 2, since I have 15 other questions I wanted. Although for my own energy, I probably need some lunch. So maybe let's
That's true.
Pause.
That's true.
And do it another time. But thank you so much for taking the time today, Stephanie. It's really been an honor.
Yes, of course. And thank you for having me on. It's like I said, it was definitely a lot of fun, a lot of play, and I can't wait to be back at some point.
All right. Thank you again to Stephanie Simpson. And thank you to each of you for being with us for this conversation on the Fresh Perspectives podcast. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, I'd be so grateful if you'd be willing to take a moment to subscribe, offer any feedback, and share it with a friend if you think they might benefit from listening. Thanks so much for your curiosity. Wishing you courage and compassion.